I'm Trace Gallagher in for Shepard Smith. This is Studio B. Time now for the top of the news. And there is breaking news now in Egypt. State-run Nile TV is reporting that witnesses say masked men set fire to the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood in eastern Egypt. The controversial President Morsi was a leader of that group before he officially resigned after winning the presidential election. 2 weeks ago, Egypt's new president essentially made himself a dictator, giving himself absolute power, and tensions have been on the rise ever since. And just hours ago, President Morsi asking protesters outside his palace to, quote, cool it and give a chance to new talks aimed at stemming backlash over his controversial power grab. But so far, the president's call for calm has gone nowhere. You can see the president's supporters tearing down tents, protesters set up outside the presidential palace. The two sides throwing rocks and firebombs at one another. Yesterday, opponents stormed the palace grounds. The president's backers in the Muslim Brotherhood then showed up in force and ready for a fight. This all began when Egypt's new president essentially made himself a dictator. The pro-democracy protesters are demanding he give up those near absolute powers. Steve Harrigan with the news. He's live for us in Cairo. And Steve, these are really some of the biggest crowds we have seen yet.
Some of the largest crowds and also some of the most violent. Things have calmed down in the last hour or two just after 10 p.m. here in Egypt, but really some of the worst clashes we've seen in 2 weeks of protests here. It wasn't police versus the protesters, but really civilian on civilian. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood who support President Morsi versus those who want to drive him from office. And all of this conflict happening right outside the presidential palace. It began with pushing, then sticks and rocks, then Molotov cocktails, then shots fired. Some of the worst and angriest demonstrations we've seen, showing just how bitterly this country right now is divided, Trace.
Steve, what do we know about what's behind this latest round of violence?
Well, for the first 2 weeks of the protest, the anti-Morsi demonstrators met here in Tahrir Square. When their numbers began to dwindle yesterday, they decided to march on the presidential palace. Up until now, there's been a lot of restraint on behalf of the pro-Morsi supporters, that Muslim Brotherhood. That restraint was finally broken after the march on the palace, where the palace walls were written on with graffiti. They decided to take matters into their own hands instead of calling the police, and really moved in on force. The stick, rock, and later gun battle is exactly what followed, Trace.
Steve Harrigan live for us in what is now late evening in Cairo. Steve, thank you.